I think what I love the most about Islam is the individual reflection through prayer. There's a big focus in Islam on stopping to reflect. We as Muslims are charged with praying 5 times a day minimum. And just that time where you check out from daily tasks in order to pray and reflect on your connection with God, and you can do it anywhere. It doesn't have to be in a mosque, and you have direct connection with God. I think that is one of the things that I really appreciate the most about Islam. Well, Islam came into my parents' life through my father. My father was born and raised as an Episcopal in Memphis, Tennessee, and in the late 70s, he became really interested in learning about different faiths. And he converted to Islam around that time, shortly before I was born. And then a few years later, my mother also converted. She was raised as a Catholic. Honestly, I have to say I've never felt discriminated against because of my hijab. And to be quite honest, I think it's probably because of the way in which I wear it, and also because of my ethnicity. As an African American, I have grown up wearing it wrapped like this, which is very much cultural based. And so I think a lot of people associate it more with African culture before they immediately assume that I'm a Muslim. But I do wear it draped at times, and I do sometimes notice a different reaction when I drape it versus when I wrap it. I think as a teacher, students are always interested in the teacher, like, oh, who is this person that is in front of us day in and day out? And I do think that my students get a little curious about me because on one hand, they see, oh, she's African American, but yet she's also maybe dressed in a style that may not be the typical way a lot of African Americans dress. But then her name is Arabic. It's a very Arabic name, Aisha Sharif. So they probably are wondering, okay, is she a Muslim? What's this going on? And I think a lot of them are intrigued but may not want to be too forward in asking me that. But I do sometimes bring it up when it's appropriate for an assignment that they're working on, or I can use myself as an example. Just recently, they were doing a personal essay in which they had to write about an identity that they felt differently about. And so I used myself as an example, how it feels to be Muslim me. And I think when I disclosed that I was Muslim, a lot of them kind of stood up and were like, wow, that's really interesting. And I've had a lot of people ask me outside of class, so, you know, what's that like, or what's that like? I really appreciate you sharing that with me because I've never had a Muslim teacher before, you know. So for many of them, I am their first Muslim teacher. And I think that's really great that I can represent Islam in that way. Well, I think as far as my experiences in Kansas City, as far as the way that people have treated me here versus some other cities, I don't really notice a huge difference. I will say that the one thing that I do notice is that there are really separate communities within Kansas City. It's very easy to kind of not end up integrating with non-Muslims. It's a lot of Muslims here mingle with just Muslims, so I would almost say it was the exact opposite. I feel like there's a lack of any type of response because I think it's so easy to be separate, which I think is somewhat reflective of communities in the Midwest. I noticed the same thing when I lived in St. Louis. St. Louis is a smaller city, but not smaller with the number of people, but the way that the communities are set up, they're closer, but it's still easy to be segregated in St. Louis as well. So I kind of felt that way. Versus when I was in Memphis, I think there's not that much to do and there's not as many people in Memphis, so you almost can't avoid the integration in that sense. So I have noticed a change between how people viewed Islam before 9/11 and how they viewed it afterwards. And I also think it was my own maturation. When 9/11 happened, I was in high school, or actually I was in college. And I think that there was a big shift into wanting to blame a religion for the actions of individuals. But thankfully, I think it's also caused a lot of dialogue and interfaith to occur. So I've actually seen a little bit of both. I've seen a lot of negativity, but I've also seen a lot of positivity. And I think a lot of foreign actions have caused people to really self-reflect on their own connections with their own faith paths. Well, if I could send a message to non-Muslim Americans who may have some fear about Islam, I would just ask them to reflect about ways in which perhaps their own faith has been miscommunicated. Growing up in an extended family with Catholics, I know firsthand what it's like on the other side as Catholics for them to be ridiculed in the media based upon things that certain priests did that were really horrific. And no Catholic wants to be judged based upon those actions of sick men. And so I would say use that as a way to recognize that that same thing is happening in Islam. These actions of these terrorists who claim to be Muslim, right, are just those things, actions by those men, and not a reflection of our society or as our faith.